that in some future life that will be experienced again. Then meditating on the sixfold subdivision of suffering from the mind is highly beneficial when we can link it in this way to such cases of reincarnation time. And then we have the eightfold subdivision of suffering. The four first sufferings specific to a human rebirth in general, also already said. Birth, aging, sickness and death. And the last four, which are general. Encountering what is unpleasant, not encountering what is pleasant, not getting what one wants, and the general suffering of the five agonies. Then, as Westerners, we have almost no experience of the suffering of birth, since birth occurs in hospitals and pain is controlled. And we have limited experience of the suffering of sickness. Aging and death tend to occur out of sight, especially the final phase of aging leading to death typically occurs in an institutional setting. Many Westerners do not visit their family at this point. I used to visit old people's homes in Switzerland. It was quite surprising that once an older person entered an institution, the family just stopped coming, without it's ever being a formal decision. And I never forget, I went with this old friend who was a Christian Orthodox monk to one institution. He had a synod, he was Orthodox, and I was speaking with some of the old ones in the lobby. And this old lady came to me and she said, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Lausanne, here in town." She said, "Oh, you must know my son, Mr. Bash." Now, Bash in Lausanne is not as widespread as Ridley or, I don't know, Bruce something or something in Adelaide. Everyone's called Bash. So I said, "Oh, really?" Yes, Mr. Bash. And she became very agitated. And I said, "Well, I must know him, yes, I really must know him." And she said, "Please, next time you see him, tell him it's okay if he doesn't come too often, but I'd like to see him from time to time." And this is, how we treat our elderly. It's shameful. It is not right for it. We ourselves behave shamefully, and we do not reap the benefit of seeing the aging process, which of course is to reflect on our own condition. They, from their side, experience the suffering of abandonment. Then there are four wrong engagements of the truth of suffering, which are really topics of meditation. The first is seeing the contaminated aggregates, in other words, ourselves, as clean and as happy. This is the materials of our mind view. We see ourselves as clean and as fundamentally happy. And to see ourselves as clean, obviously, we must wash frequently. So the West has become obsessed with hygiene, with this endless scrubbing and washing of the body. And I never forget an Indian lady. She was not Buddhist, but she had a very sharp mind. And she put it very bluntly. We were talking once, and she said to me, "Well, Westerners wash all the time because they want to be always ready to have sex." And I thought that's exactly it. Sex is a dirty process. It involves basically the urogenital components of the body. It's the dirtiest part of the human body. Then, to maintain the fantasy that our bodies are desirable, we wash. Not from time to time, every 2 or 3 days, we need. Every day, twice a day, 3 times a day. We will brush our teeth 2 or 3 times a day. We brush our teeth so much we erode the gums away. Then obviously our teeth become yellow with age, so we whiten them. Then one's skin becomes wrinkled with age, so one pulls it. I have known some cases in Singapore, and I know 1 or 2 even in Australia, where you put it the first time, it's okay, right? And when you put it the second time, the person tends to have a bit of a frozen look. By the time you put it the third time, the opening for the eyes tends to shift a bit, smile, they can't say anything, the face becomes like a mask, it's quite uncomfortable when you see it. Then this arises from wrong engagements of the truth of suffering. If one sees one's body as a locus of suffering, and as dirty, I think one's a much happier person. The human body is a very dirty business. Then if you want to be convinced of this, there is one key point for meditation. Every day, when you go to the toilet. Go to the toilet, and after you have done what you have to do, look at what comes out. Look carefully. That is the nature of the human body. That's it. As a friend of mine who is a very fine Western monk put it, the human body is beautiful at a depth of 0.5 millimeter of skin. Beyond that, it is horror. Imagine removing that 0.5 millimeter of skin. And that is something out of the horror. Right. Then the two remaining wrong engagements are viewing the contaminated amulets, particularly in this case the mind or the soul, as permanent, which is a view of most of the Indian schools of philosophy, of Christianity, and perhaps of Islam and Judaism, and viewing oneself as having a self, which is, in a self here refers to a soul. It's a permanent one and independent entity. This is the case of all the great religions, as well as all the orthodox introductions. So you can see that meditation on the noble truth of suffering is very profound. I cannot encourage you too much to meditate on the first noble truth. The three subdivisions of suffering, suffering of suffering, suffering of change, and pervasive suffering. The 6 and the 8 subdivisions of suffering. Applying them to yourselves, and then the 4 wrong engagements of the truth of suffering. And as I mentioned at TBI, I don't want to put you on the spot in this matter, but when I went to India with some students of TBI, I was very surprised by the fact that over the days and the weeks in India, everyone was turning much, much more grey. I mean, it was quite astonishing. People's hair was just turning grey by the day. Then, perhaps some people use, what do you call this, colored hair dye? If you can, it's good not to use it. If you can accept your own aging, look at your hair turning grey, look at your teeth turning yellow, look at the wrinkles coming. It's a great benefit for the mind. And the more you try to make believe you are not aging, the more really you are involved in one of the wrong engagements of the noble truth of suffering, seeing the body as clean and permanent. But there are some things we can do on a daily basis which are not really meditation, and rather coarse, but very helpful. Very helpful. And the second noble truth, the noble truth of the origin of suffering, I thought I would present to you in the light of an example, because it is a complex topic, one of the more complex ones. It's basically the origin of suffering is both karma and pleasure. Then we will cover briefly the general features of karma, and then I will give you an example to show you how it might unfold. So karma is threefold. We have virtuous karma and non-virtuous karma, which lead to rebirths in the higher and the lower realms. And then there is a specific category of karma, called immutable karma, which can only be generated with a modicum of concentration, literally with one of the dhyanas. This karma, and only this karma, leads to rebirth in the formless realms. And this is basically, from the Buddhist standpoint, the goal of all of the non-Buddhist Hindu schools. When a non-Buddhist Hindu yogi aims for moksha through samadhi, what he actually is doing is preparing a rebirth in the formless realms. And he will attain it. It's perfectly possible. The single-pointed concentration creates a cause for rebirth as what really is the God. Is a formless entity, tremendous mental power, tremendous bliss. But it's a state of affairs which lasts a very long time, but is not eternal. Then, when one falls from the bliss of samadhi, which is the highest bliss in psychic existence, one falls back to the level of a normally sentient being, without having had the opportunity of practicing any type of virtue. So things can get quite difficult. And the afflictions, klesha in other words, are subdivided into the well-known three causes: desire, anger, and their root, ignorance. So the best way to approach karma is reflecting on its general features first. Karma is definite, it's an increasing function of time. One will not experience karma which has not been accumulated, and it is indestructible. When I was a very young novice, I would go to the forests in Switzerland and look at trees and use the pine trees as examples of karma. It looks very well. The seed of the pine tree is the karmic imprint. And you can see how a very small seed can only give rise to, let's say, the seed of a pine tree can only give rise to a pine tree, can never give rise to an oak. This is the definiteness of karma. In other words, virtuous karmic imprints can only give rise to happiness. They can never give rise to unhappiness. Karma is an increasing function of time, indeed. Once you've cast a pine tree cone, and the seed is in the ground, the pine tree will grow and grow and grow, and a small cone creates a pine tree which can shelter maybe hundreds of birds. And then one does not experience the results of karma not accumulated. There is no such thing as a pine tree for which a pine cone wasn't cast. It does not exist. And finally, karma is indestructible. The potency of the pine tree's seed to give rise to a pine tree is eternal, unless the seed is scorched. Traditionally it is said, scorched by the fire. So the definiteness of karma refers simply to the fact that virtue gives rise to happiness and non-virtue to suffering. And this is something which we can only understand through the teachings of one who is omniscient. We ourselves do not have the capacity to gain this understanding. We have to be able to look over the cycle of lives in their totality. We cannot. So we can see, relying on memories, maybe 1, 2, 3 lives maximum. People who gain the capacity to see other people's lives through concentration can see a couple lives in the past, not more than that. Sometimes they say up to 100 or 1,000, but that's nothing compared to the totality of lives. Buddha Shakyamuni, as Buddhists we believe, gained omniscience. Then this omniscience enabled him to see the causal relations, to see what deeds led to happiness at some points in the future, and what deeds led to unhappiness. So these elements of the Buddhist teachings we have to basically accept until we ourselves reach the point where we can verify them for ourselves. Then, just as a miracle of water, karma is an increasing function of time, and we don't have time to enter into this here, but karma can very conveniently be understood in terms of chaos theory. You all know about chaos theory. The flutter of the butterfly over China gives rise to a hurricane on the South American coast. In other words, the huge amplification of a phenomenon due to specific initial conditions. Now, interestingly enough, for chaotic motion to occur, 2 factors are necessary. You need a very high sensitivity on it, or the sensitive dependency on initial conditions, and recurrence, in other words, a feedback loop. Both are clearly present in the case of karma. And I talked about this at TBI not quite 2 years ago, so we won't enter into it here. But if you're interested, you might want to read Benoît Mandelbrot's books on fractal theory, and some good books on chaos theory, and trying to establish the links. It's quite fascinating. Thirdly, one does not experience the results of karma not accumulated. What this means is that every experience of pleasure or suffering is necessarily karmically conditioned. Experiences which are not experiences of pleasure or suffering are not necessarily karmically conditioned. So that means, in other words, that not everything is karmically conditioned. We do not live in a rigidly deterministic world. But as I am seated here, for instance, with you, if I observe my own body, when I observe it, I can see that there is discomfort in the back. That sensation of discomfort in the back is of the nature of suffering. That suffering is a karmic result. It is not fortuitous. If I were to sit in this position and not experience suffering in the back, even though my back is in this position, then it is clear that karma would not have been accumulated. So it is not the event which is the result of karma. It is the pleasure or the suffering in reaction to the event. Arhats experience, for instance, accidents. You can be an arhat who's gone beyond karma causality and, let's say, stumble on the street and crash. That is not the result of karma. But when the arhat trips and falls to the ground, the arhat feels nothing. It's quite important, because otherwise, if one does not make this distinction, then basically one ends up in a world in which we are in a straitjacket, as it were. Everything is determined by past events and so forth. Then, when it comes to neutral events, they are generally, or they can be, the product of neutral karma, but there is no necessity to this. Finally, karma, like a diamond, is indestructible. And this has to be qualified. When we say karma is indestructible, virtuous karma certainly can be destroyed. And the one force which can destroy karma is anger. Virtuous karma can be destroyed by anger, like the potency of a grain can be scorched by fire. Then, when one thinks about this, anger is by far the most dangerous enemy to our spiritual practice. By far. So these are, to repeat, the four main characteristics of karma. Karma is definite, it is increasing, one does not experience the results of karma not accumulated, and it is indestructible. Then karma can be subdivided into two: projecting and completing karma. Projecting karma is karma which defines one life. Completing karma fleshes out that life. It gives the events within that life. So you might have the projecting karma to be reborn as a human being in the next life. But what completing karma you have is another question. Will you be reborn as a human being in Australia? Or, let us say, in Iraq? Will you be reborn rich or poor, intelligent or limited in your capacities? That is all completing karma. Then when projecting karma is virtuous, it leads to a higher rebirth. And, the error should go through. If it's non-virtuous, it leads to a lower rebirth. When completing karma is virtuous, it leads to happy events and conditions in the life. And when it is non-virtuous, it leads to unhappy events. So if we look at the permutations between completing and projecting karma, we can see that when projecting karma is virtuous, there is a good rebirth, and completing karma is virtuous, you're in an ideal situation. You're born as an Australian and you're wealthy. Everything is going well. When projecting karma is virtuous, when you have good rebirth, and completing karma is non-virtuous, you'll be reborn as a human being, but you will be in India and poor. When projecting karma is non-virtuous, when you have a bad rebirth, and completing karma is virtuous, you'll be reborn as Mandy's dogs, Bobby and Meaty. And when projecting karma is non-virtuous and completing karma is non-virtuous, you'll be reborn as a dog and it will be in India. So these are the possible permutations of projecting and completing karma. Now, for a karmic deed to necessarily lead to its result, this deed must be complete. And a complete karmic deed has 4 components. Such a deed has a basis, a motivation, a performance, and a completion. And I won't enter too much in the subdivisions of the motivation. So what does this mean if we take an example? Let us take the deed of killing a little insect. Let's assume we want to inflict suffering on a small creature. We need a basis, in other words, an insect. Then we actually must be motivated to do this. It's not sufficient for this to happen by accident when we're walking down the street. We must see the insect, and as Asanga puts it, we must perceive it, in other words, recognize it. We must wish to harm it, and that wish must be motivated by an affliction, anger, or desire. There must be a motivation. The deed must be performed. We must actually, let's say, lift our foot to crush the ant. And that performance must lead to completion. In other words, the ant must die as a result. A deed with these 4 characteristics is a complete non-virtuous deed of killing. Such a deed necessarily leads to a karmic result, unless it is purified. If any of the features is missing, the deed is incomplete, and it may not lead to a karmic result. It is uncertain. If, for instance, there's an ant, we're walking on the street, we have no intention of crushing the ant, we crush it by accident. Then we have crushed it, but the ant dies. The motivation isn't there, the deed is incomplete. It is not a complete deed of killing. It will not lead to the maturation of a deed of killing. Then let us take an example of a complete deed of killing, and I have chosen what I presented at TBI in the past, which is, I think, quite confrontational, but it has to be addressed in our society, which is abortion in general and late-term abortion in particular. Then, as you know, abortion involves, late-term abortion especially involves the partial extraction of the fetus and then the decerebration of the fetus, where a needle is injected in the skull and all the brain of the fetus is sucked out. Such a deed is a full deed of killing a human being. Then, for such a deed to be a complete karmic deed, let us analyze what is required. The basis, generally speaking, for a deed of killing, the basis can either be a living being in general or another living being, and there's a debate among Buddhist scholars in this matter whether suicide is a complete deed of killing or not. After one is killing oneself. Then Jetsunapa considers suicide as a complete deed of killing. Asanga does not. Asanga considers it is a non-virtuous deed, that is undeniable, but because one is killing oneself, it cannot be a complete deed of killing. It's a semantic distinction. In either case, it is a non-virtuous deed, and we have a non-virtuous deed. Then, as we said, the motivation must be present for the deed to be performed. And the motivation, in Asanga's presentation, has 3 subdivisions: perception, motivation, and affliction. Perception means that one correctly perceives being. If, for instance, I were to perceive an ant as a grasshopper, and based on that perception kill the ant, perception is incorrect, and the deed will be incorrect. Perception can be affected by drugs, by alcohol, by misunderstanding. Motivation must be the will to kill. If motivation is absent, or let's say, if one were to act out of compassion, the deed would not be complete. And affliction must be present. Affliction here refers to one of the major afflictions, desire, hatred, or ignorance. Then in the case of performance, for instance, for abortion, abortion can be performed through weapons, drugs, or even through the use of paranormal powers. In every single case, such a performance amounts to a deed of killing. Whether one does it oneself or orders another to do it. Actually, from a Buddhist standpoint, if one orders another to do it, the deed is karmically heavy, because one has drawn another in one's own non-virtuous deeds. And the deed, to be complete, must lead to the death of the victim before the killer dies. If that is the case, the deed is complete, karmically complete, otherwise not. So let us take the path leading to a complete deed of killing in the case of an abortion. What does this involve? For an abortion to be complete, the fetus must be alive. If the fetus were dead in utero, there's no basis. There can be no basis for abortion. The intent of the motivation must be present. One must intend to kill. If abortion occurs by accident, or let's say to save the mother, it is not a complete deed of killing. Then the mindset must be motivated by a delusion. Generally, the cases of abortion I have encountered are often out of anger. If it were out of compassion, for any particular reason, again, the deed would not be complete. The fetus must be aborted, and the fetus must die before the abortionist dies. In such a case, the deed is complete. Then I will not talk here about factors which amplify the karmic potency of the deed. We don't have time. I mentioned them at TBI in the past. I brought up the case of abortion because abortion is a non-virtuous deed in which karmic amplification is very powerful because of the closeness between mother and child. Number one, it is generally speaking that the mother who does take the decision. It is rare for an abortion to be performed without the consent of the mother for medical reasons alone. And abortion, especially late-term abortion, is particularly cruel in its performance. Then this cruelty amplifies the karmic consequences. Then I have known one case of someone who, I believe it was a legal abortion in America before abortion was allowed. And later term, she became a Buddhist later on in life, but the karmic consequences were very heavy. And actually she died before her time of cancer of the womb. And she was convinced, she was a good Buddhist scholar, that this was a karmic consequence of a late-term abortion. So such deeds are very heavy karmically. Then, if one is in the unfortunate situation where one basically is obliged to perform an unrighteous deed, it's very important to avoid amplification and to purify as much as possible. Obviously, any deed performed with respect to a member of one's family, by definition, is a karmically powerful deed. Offending one's parents, hurting one's children, abandoning one's spouse. These are very potent deeds karmically because of the closeness between the two parties. Harsh words inflicted to one's parents are much more potent than perhaps stealing something from someone who has never met. Especially if, from the standpoint of the parents, there has been especially if, from the standpoint of one's parents, there has been great affection and love. So we have to be particularly careful with those with whom we are closely related. Then this is the reason for which it is said that the spiritual teacher is one of the karmically most potent beings, because, my apologies, the spiritual teacher actually imparts the teachings to us. And there is no greater kindness than this. Then, before choosing a spiritual teacher, one must reflect very carefully, because one is bringing into the karmic circuit one of the most powerful amplifiers there is. At present, the maturation of karma leads to these two paths. Non-virtuous karma leads here to jail and suffering. Virtuous karma leads here. People end up with tragic experiences in their lives, not by accident, but because they accumulated the karmic causes for it. People are born wealthy and only experience happiness in their lives, not by accident, but because they accumulated the causes for it. There is therefore no ground for envy in our relations with others. We reap what we sow. What we have sown in the past life, we reap in this life. Then we have no control over that. But we do have control over what we sow in this life. What we sow in this life, we will reap in future lives. We may even reap at the end of this life, if the deed is powerful enough. So karmic maturation can be distinguished in terms of three effects. The effect of maturation, causally concordant effects, and environmental effects. The effect of maturation of karma is the same as the propelling karma. It's a rebirth, happy or unhappy, as a human or as an animal. Causally concordant effects are effects which are similar to the cause. So for instance, if one performs a non-virtuous deed of killing in a previous life, in a future life, one will have a habituation with killing, a fascination with killing, or one may even enjoy killing. This is a causally concordant result. As a result, one will have a far greater chance of killing again in a future life and experiencing non-virtuous karma in a later life again. And the third karmic maturation is an environmental effect. One is born in a milieu, an environment, which reflects one's karma. For instance, as a pharmacist, one has sold overpriced and false medicine, very common in third world countries. Karmically, the possible result would be to be reborn in a country in which medicine is unavailable or fake, as is the case in much of India. The environment reflects the karma of the person who has performed the deed. One has led a violent life in a previous life, harmed others. As a result, one is reborn in a violent and harsh society. Let's say Afghanistan, in which an Afghani told me, face to face, the only value was revenge. If you can imagine. Then let us take a case of karmic maturation. This is a case of a Sri Lankan Vijayatne, which I have already presented at TBI. We're going to analyze it in great detail in the context of the presentation of the second noble truth of the origin of suffering. So Vijayatne was born in 1947 in Ugalkakota in Sri Lanka. And from birth, he had a marked deformity of the right breast and arm, and a strong resemblance to his father's deceased brother, Alkamhani. As in many of Stevenson's cases, as soon as he started talking at age 2.5, he started talking about his past life. And he said he had been born with a withered arm because he had murdered his wife, Odimenike, in a previous life. He clearly remembered being his father's deceased brother. Now what's striking in this case is that all the details about his father's brother had been kept quiet because it was a family scandal. His father's brother was a murderer who was sentenced to death for murder and hanged at the gallows. The young child had never heard this. Then the deformities you can see are very striking. The right arm is atrophied, and most of the right digits are absent. he himself attributed this directly to the non-virtuous karma he had accumulated in a previous life from killing his wife-to-be. His right pectoral muscle was also atrophied. It was hypoplasia of the pectoral muscle and of the third rib. Now, what happened to Radharani, the recollected rebirth? Radharani was rejected by his wife-to-be. And then, if you look carefully, you will see he performed what amounts to a complete deed of killing. Upon being rejected, he walked back to his village and sharpened his knife, his kris, paid off all his debts, and returned to his Polymedicus village, his wife-to-be on foot. It's very clear premeditation. It's a cold-blooded murder. He stabbed her to death at least 3 times with his right hand. And the autopsy indicates Polymedicus was stabbed in the back and the left axilla, the left armpit, as she raised her arm to protect her face. And you have here very powerful karmic amplification. One is murdering a defenseless person, a woman, who is trying to protect herself. So the karma of killing has become very powerful. Then, upon arrest, he refused to plead guilty. In other words, there was no repentance. None of the 4 forces which can act as an antidote to the retribution of karma was present. During the execution in 1928, at the almsgiving for a higher rebirth, alms were offered to Buddhist monks which were present, he told his brother he would return as his son on the gallows. And he remembered clearly being executed by hanging in 1928. And I shall skip a bit to remember the details of the execution. But when the trap was sprung, his last thought was of his brother. And as the noose was tightening around his neck, he remembered falling in a pit of fire. Vijayaratne, who had these memories, as of the age of 14, still expressed no regret whatsoever for the murder he had committed in a previous life, and said he would murder again if he was rejected. It's only in his 20s that the outlook changes. In addition to recollecting this human rebirth, Vijayaratne remembered non-human lives. It's a very striking case. He remembers dropping into a pit of fire, which seems to be a memory of a hell realm of rebirth. And he remembers flitting through the air, perched on treetops. In that life, Vijayaratne had a series of psychotic episodes which caused his internment in a psychiatric asylum, during which he behaved like a bird, making a nest after gathering twigs, and hopping in the nest and trying to fly. So if we synthesize the data we have of Vijayaratne's recollected lives, this is Vijayaratne, 4th life, born in 1947. In that life, he is rejected by women, suffers from psychotic episodes, has an atrophied right arm, and chest muscles and ribs are atrophied. The main recollected life occurs 3 lives before. He recollects a human life as Radharani, rejected by his second wife, who murdered her in 1927 and was executed in 1928. Then, between 1928 and 1947, we have 18 and a half years, which seem to have been spent in the lower worlds. There are very few memories. The memory of the hell realm is only a memory of fire at the instant of the execution. And the animal rebirth we can infer from his memory of flying from tree to tree. It's the only memory during that rebirth. So let us analyze carefully the karmic background of the hell rebirth, this rebirth. What is it in life 1 which caused in life 2 a hell rebirth? It is a complete deed of murder. The murder of his second wife to be Polymedicus. The basis was present. There was a person, Polymedicus. the motivation to kill for revenge for being spurned. The performance, repeated stabbing. She was stabbed at least 3 times. The completion, she died before he died. In addition, powerful amplification was present. She was defenseless. She was a woman. She trusted him. He premeditated the murder. It was performed with great savagery. After the deed, there was no repentance. He pleaded not guilty in court. And this is evinced by the fact that in his future rebirth, he still felt that what he had done was legitimate. The absence of repentance prevents really any attenuation of the karmic weight of the deed. So what is the projecting karma of this deed of murder during life 1? It's clearly a rebirth in the with, based on his account, no experience. So it's at the moment of execution, he directly experiences a Hera, which means probably he was reborn in Avicii, in the lowest Hera, simply because of the extreme violence of the deed and karmic amplification. Then, as to the completing karma that life is simply not know, there must have been some attenuating factor because the Hera rebirth was relatively short. If we consider the life of the bird to be, 2 years, 3 years from birth, then we have 15, 16 years in a Hera. This is fairly short. So something must have curtailed their rebirth. Then, what is the karmic background of Vijayaragni's 4th life, his human life? But the animal life I will not speak because frankly we have no details about it. But about his 4th life we can try to understand the karmic unfolding, what led from life 1 to life 4. Vijayaragni had committed murder in life 1. What karma in life 1 could cause a human rebirth in life? It must be a virtuous karmic imprint. Non-virtuous karmic imprint of murder nurtured immediately with the Hera rebirth. Then, for a human rebirth, one needs a powerful virtuous karmic imprint. And the one which does come to mind, and there is no certainty in this matter, because obviously we don't have access to Vijayaragni's mind, is the feeling of compassion for his brother on the gallows. Now this is actually a powerful virtuous karmic imprint. A feeling of compassion with great amplification, because it is for one's own family member, one's brother. Then, such a feeling at the very time of one's death, instance before one is executed, would be karmically very important. And this might act as the karmic projecting cause for life, for rebirth as a human being. And after the completing karma, in other words, what fleshed out the 4th life, Vijayaragni took a vow at the time of his death to return as his brother's son. Such vows in general are powerful, but at this time particularly so. And the vow was actually that he was reborn as his brother's son. But he also had non-virtuous completing karma through the murder of Podimenikli carried over. And this led to the hypoplasia of the right arm, which dealt the fatal blow. It's actually the arm, his arm, which struck, which was deformed 3 lives later. The digits of the right hand, which were used in the blow, were atrophied. And the pectoral muscle, which actually activates the arm, was atrophied as well. So you can see here a clear case of good projecting karma and bad completing karma. And you can see how they are probably related to events in his 1st life. There is no certainty in this matter, but this is how one would analyze Stevenson's cases of the reincarnation time, using a Buddhist karmic template. So if we look at the permutations between projecting and karmic and completing karma for Vijayartha's lives 2, 3, and 4, there's not a single life in which he has good projecting and good completing karma. Not one. There is one life in which he has bad projecting karma and bad completing karma. That is the second life as a Harappi. After this, a slightly better life during which he has bad projecting karma, but good completing karma. The bird, from what little we know, must have led a reasonably comfortable bird-like life. There's no evidence to the contrary. And finally, there is one life with good projecting karma and bad completing karma as a human being in a poor country with severe deformities. This is how the noble truth of the origin of suffering unfolds. Then, I think the best approach for us in trying to understand Buddhist teachings is, upon studying cases of reincarnation type, which are mentioned in Stevenson's works, especially cases such as this one, where there are very strong correlations between the two lives, to analyze them carefully, not just to study the case, but read the case carefully,